A SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket with a national security payload grounded following pre-flight issues. While the timeline for launching the important X-37B spaceplane is up in the air, it's causing a number of delays on the ground for the U.S. Space Force and likely a robotic mission to the moon as well. Space Force leaders from around the country were gathered in Orlando, Florida this week for the first Space Power Conference. The space race with China was top of mind for many, how the nation's guardians and commercial partners are preparing to respond. And Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket may finally be making its debut next year. We're hearing about the progress from some of the company's leadership. Space News military space reporter Sandra Erwin and Ars Technica space reporter Stephen Clark join in for insight and analysis. From the Spaceflight Now News Bureau at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, this is news from the press site.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
Copies.
On board the International Space Station.
Liftoff. Go Falcon, go Dragon, go Crew 7.
This allows us to go faster and to have better technology.
When we start putting humans on that vehicle, the excitement is even going to amp up even more.
Thanks for taking the time to answer our questions. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of News from the Press Site. We're joining you from our Spaceflight Now News Bureau here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. I'm Will Robinson-Smith. Thank you so much for spending part of your afternoon with us. Just a bit of housekeeping at the top of this show, just to let you know how things are going to run. We've got a whole host of topics that we're going to be talking about from the week that was in space news. As you heard, we also have some fabulous guests joining us on the panel to break it all down for you as well. But we want you to be a part of this show and really bring this coverage into wherever you're watching. So throughout the show, our Adam Bernstein is going to be monitoring the YouTube chat, the live chat there. So if you'd like to ask a question or leave a comment either for myself or for one of our guests, just be sure to use the YouTube Super Chat feature. That way you're entering part of the conversation as well as helping to support what we do here at Spaceflight Now. Just want to make sure that your comment is appropriate to be read on our show, and we'll be sure to bring you in on the social breaks. And so, as we mentioned, it's been a very busy week in spaceflight and space news, as it is all the time, though. Fortunately, we have a couple of great guests joining in to break it all down for us this afternoon. First off, we want to introduce Sandra Erwin. She spent more than 2 decades covering the military, Congress, and the defense industry for NDIA's National Defense Magazine and was also the Pentagon correspondent for Real Clear News. She joined Space News in 2017. Sandra, welcome.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And the man on the far side is no stranger to those of you who have been with Spaceflight Now for some time. Stephen Clark was with this publication for a little over 14 years, including 5 years as the editor. Earlier this year, he joined Ars Technica, where he's continuing on his excellent work as a space reporter there, alongside other folks like Eric Berger. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Will.
Absolutely. And so let's jump into the main story that we've got this week. Obviously, this was potentially going to be the week where we were talking about the 5th Falcon Heavy launch with the X-37B orbital test vehicle on board. This is, for those who haven't been paying super close attention to the program, uncrewed space plane, about a quarter of the size of the shuttle orbiter. It was going to launch on the Falcon Heavy rocket. It first launched back in 2010. You see the pad there, 39A, where it was going to lift off. However, a couple things helped scuttle that. First, there was the bad weather that we had on Sunday. Then on Monday, in the run-up to the launch of it, SpaceX announced that they were going to be standing down from that launch attempt to work through some what they generically called ground systems issues. So bringing in our panel back to talk about this, Stephen, I want to go to you first, since you had the opportunity to talk with Space Force's Assured Access to Space Directorate about this delay. What were some of the things that you learned about, why this was delayed and potentially how long the X-37B may remain on the ground here?
Yes, Will. So they noticed a couple of things during the launch preparations going into Monday's launch attempt. One of those was that ground system issue that you mentioned. I don't know any more details beyond that it was a ground system issue. SpaceX hasn't divulged any detail, and the Space Force wasn't very forthcoming either, but they did say that ground system issue was probably going to be resolved by middle of this week. So I think that's behind them now, but there are some other issues with the Falcon Heavy itself that they're now trying to troubleshoot, and they rolled the rocket back into the hangar at Kennedy Space Center a couple of days ago, I believe now, and they are servicing the rocket, and they hope to get it back on the pad for a launch by the end of the year. We'll see if that happens. I think a lot of things have to go right for that to happen, so there's a chance it could delay into January.
And I suppose it wouldn't necessarily take another static fire test for it to go ahead with the launch, but that's not necessarily out of the realm of possibility, though, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. After the work they do on the rocket, they may desire to do another static fire test, and if they do that, they may have to remove the payload from the rocket to do the static fire test, because they don't do these static fire tests with payload fairings on the rocket anymore. So that would add a number of days to the flow to get to the launch date.
And Sandra, as I mentioned at the top, you have extensive experience in the defense and national security space. So naturally, you've been covering space throughout the full duration of the X-37B as a program. Talk to me a little bit about what you've been able to learn, as much as that is, about this space plane, and what its capabilities are and what they were kind of hoping to use it for.
Yes, Will, thank you. And before I get into that, congratulations on your new pod. It's very exciting, and I hope we continue to do this for a long time. But back to the X-37B, I think it's obviously it's emblematic of. Today, it's viewed as emblematic of space competition, of space strategic competition, particularly. Years ago, we did not know very much about it. We knew that it existed. We knew that Boeing was the prime contractor, and there is there were just always this mystery about it. And then when and it was always, under the Air Force up until 2020, when the Space Force became a separate service, and then they started talking about the space plane a little bit more. It's still a classified program, partially classified, at least. And the Space Force started putting out ads promoting the Space Force that had a picture of the X-37 in it. So it was a little bit of a shift, and the program is now managed jointly by the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office and the Space Force. We also know that they are putting more experiments than they used to. They built a new, a new structure inside it so they can put in more experiments. I think in this particular mission that they were hoping to launch this week, there were multiple military, NASA, Air Force Academy. There were a bunch of experiments. They don't necessarily tell us all the experiments, but I think the chief of space operations, he spoke with us at the Space Power Conference that you mentioned earlier, and he said, this is about great power competition, and it's something the space plane is one of the most watched vehicles in space. When it's out flying, people want to see it. People want to know what it does. And it's something that they know they can send to space and bring it back. So it's a very powerful capability. And I think now that China also has a space plane, it's just taken on a new dimension. We just heard China launched for the third time its space plane. The US, this would have been the seventh launch, but now it's a real competition. And I don't know if you know Andrew Jones. He covers China's space program for Space News, and he said with this third mission to expect new tricks compared to the previous two missions. So we'll see how it goes, but it's obviously that this is a big deal, and I'm sure the Space Force would have liked for this vehicle to be in space by now. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and we're just looking at a little B-roll of the X-37B when it made one of its daylight landings here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center a few years ago. Stephen, obviously with this delay, this is going to have an impact on SpaceX's manifest. And not only for SpaceX is this a big deal, but for customers that were waiting to use Pad 39A as well. Talk about the knock-on implications of this, because whether Pad 40 is ready is going to be an indication of if the Axiom 3 space mission to the International Space Station, that's going to go off from that pad. If that one's not ready, it's going to have to go from 39A. And of course, that means they're going to have to get the heavy clear to flip it over to a Falcon 9 configuration. Or if 40 is ready, then Intuitive Machines obviously is waiting and can only use Pad 39A to launch. So sort of parse this out for us. How big of an impact will this have moving forward?
Well, that sounds like a good problem to have it for SpaceX, because you have a lot of demand for your rockets and for your launch services. And so, yeah, you're right. They have a couple of missions next month that have kind of narrow windows to get off the ground. One of them being Intuitive Machines. They have, I think, about a 4 or 5 day window in mid-January, opening the 12th of January, to launch their first commercial lunar lander to the moon. That would potentially be one of the first two alongside Astrobotics lander, which also happens to be launching in early to mid-January from the Cape. Would be the first two U.S. landers to land on the moon if they succeed since 1972. So they have 4 days to get off the ground in January, just to make sure they hit the right trajectory to reach the moon, and then also make sure they reach the landing site with the perfect lighting conditions to enable the mission to last as long as possible on the surface. So the Falcon Heavy delay with the X-37B has a chance of impacting that date in mid-January, because they have, once SpaceX launches the Falcon Heavy, the teams at 39A will have to reconfigure the pad back to a configuration for a Falcon 9 rocket. That takes a couple of weeks, up to 3 weeks it has in the past. So if you're looking at a Falcon Heavy launch at the end of December or beginning of January, if you just do the math, there's a really good chance Intuitive Machines would miss their window to launch on a Falcon 9 in mid-January, and potentially have to wait until February, because there's only a few days per month when they can launch. So interestingly, this Intuitive Machines lander was supposed to launch in November, and they lost their launch slot in mid-November because of this same Falcon Heavy rocket. Partially, it was one of the reasons the National Security Mission was going to get priority on SpaceX's launch schedule. So they could face a similar problem coming up in January, and could move that launch back into February. And just for clarification for the people watching, if they don't know, this Intuitive Machines lander has to launch from Pad 39A, from this same site as the Falcon Heavy, because SpaceX has installed modifications to this pad only to be able to service the Intuitive Machines lander and fuel it with cryogenic propellant right before launch, because they want to minimize the amount of that cryogenic propellant that boils off on the way to the moon. So this mission, this IM-1 mission, is tied to Pad 39A. The other mission you mentioned, the Axiom 3 commercial astronaut mission to the International Space Station, could theoretically launch from either 39A or Pad 40 if SpaceX can wrap up their certification and all the approvals they need to launch crew from down at Pad 40 at the Space Force Station.
Certainly a lot to keep track of, and of course there's also Crew 8 coming up in February, also going from Pad 39A, so lots of congestion, and as soon as they can get crew capability on 40, I'm sure that'll make lots of folks happy across the board. Want to go back to something that we all shared in this week, which of course was the Space Power Conference over in Orlando, Florida. This was the first time that they've done that. It was brought in part by the Space Force Association. They were the main heads of this conference. I know the two of you have been to probably more conferences than you can count in your experience covering space news and defense. How did this one kind of stack up, and give me your sort of top line thoughts about it?
So, Will, I guess I must say that I thought this conference was going to be much smaller than it was, because it's the first one, so you don't expect such a big crowd, but they had a huge crowd, 2,000 people. And I think the best description that I heard for this conference was Colonel Max Lance, who is the commander of the Space Force European Command component. And he said, it's so nice to have a safe space for space geeks. And I think that really captured the spirit of the conference, which I guess the Space Force just wants to have a forum for the Guardians to feel at home and to feel like they can talk about space and not have to compete for attention with the Air Force. And up until now, the past 4 years, they've had their annual conference combined with the Air Force, which is a huge conference here in DC. And so they really wanted to be able to have their own forum. They wanted to be able to come out of their shells. I think the chief of the Space Force view this as a way to boost morale. There's some anecdotal evidence now that some of the Guardians are leaving or not re-enlisting because they're not happy with the opportunities, with the career development. There's a lot of opportunities in the private sector. So I think the conference provided some sessions, professional development sessions focused on career tracks, on public outreach, on ways to communicate with the media, also the state of commercial space. So I think that was really helpful. And I would say that all in all, it was a very successful event from the perspective of the Space Force, and just trying to create an identity for themselves now that they're separate from the Air Force.
And Stephen, as a fellow space geek, did you feel like it was a safe space to nerd out and get those good conversations going?
Oh, for sure. And it was a great opportunity to meet a few people in the Space Force. Of course, in the military, people rotate in and out of assignments a lot. So if you don't go to one of these conferences, if you miss a year, by the time you go back the next year, it's often somebody different in these roles. So it's a great way to connect with the decision makers in the Space Force and also in industry. And one of the takeaways that I had from this conference was, in fact, an unclassified threat briefing about China from the Chief Master Sergeant Ron Lurch, who is an enlisted member of the Space Force, who is in their intel directorate. And hearing him, couldn't go into detail because it was an unclassified setting, but hearing him kind of lay out the things that he was watching China do from open source intelligence sources that he could talk about publicly was interesting to get an idea of the things that maybe the Space Force is talking about behind the scenes.
If I can bring in a little bit of a fun fact about Sergeant Ron Lurch, he's a little bit of a celebrity because he was in charge of briefing Jeff Bezos give Jeff Bezos an unclassified briefing about threats. And he did such a great job, and Jeff Bezos was super happy. So now he is the designated briefer. When, I've heard 3 different conferences he gave that briefing on threats, and he does a really good job, and it kind of tells the average person, this is what we're facing, these are the threats. And so, yeah, he has become a little bit of a celebrity. Just wanted to throw that out.
No, thank you for that, Sandra. That's excellent. You did touch on threats, and of course, one thing that was apparent to me, that was through line throughout much of the conference, was this ongoing space race with China and some of the national security implications and things in place to prepare for and address that. So, Sandra, to you, since this is principally your realm of expertise, what were some of the key takeaways that you got from this conference as far as steps forward in pushing U.S. capability in this space race?
Yes, absolutely. The Space Force has a big mandate. They've been told by the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, that they have to posture for great power competition. And everyone always brings up the catchphrase that Kendall always says when he talks about strategy, and he says, China, 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 3 times. So I think that kind of tells the story. He wants the Air Force and the Space Force to be laser focused on this competition with China, even though we do have other national security threats. We have a war in Ukraine, Middle East, but he wants the service to be focused on the future and how to compete with China. I think basically you see that reflected not just in this conference where there was a lot of discussion on that, but I think if you look at the Pentagon's own reports, what they've been putting out in the last few months, it's a lot has to do with the competition with China in space, in missile defense, in artificial intelligence. We saw the National Defense Strategy. They put out an annual report on the PLA's military capabilities. There was a Defense Business Board report on space acquisitions that also highlighted the need to modernize and become more innovative. There was another big report on the U.S. by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission that said basically this competition with China is the new normal. That was the term that they used, and they even brought up the fact that China is not only investing in the civilian and commercial space program, but very heavily in the military side. And there's even a speculation that they're developing a nuclear weapon that would be space-based and potentially could threaten the U.S. homeland. Of course, we don't know very much about that, but it's something that was mentioned in that report. So when you think about this space power conference that we just had, I think all that is context to say that the Space Force has to posture for this competition. And I think, they're doing that with some of the investments in their budget. They're doing that also in the way of international agreements and international partnerships, which we heard quite a bit. And also they highlight the fact that the Space Force wants to deter conflict, not create conflict. So deterrence is really a very important thing in how everything that they do, because they believe that a war in space would be very bad. I mean, it would be devastating for the entire space economy. So it would be better just to prevent it and to not have, any kind of an anti-satellite weapon blowing up satellites. So that would be very detrimental for everyone doing business in space. So those are kind of the big themes that we heard, and we're going to continue to hear going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And the two of you were also able to just sort of going back to the tit for tat and the conversation we had a little bit earlier about the X-37B. You were able to talk with General Chance Saltzman. For those that are unfamiliar, he's the Space Force's senior officer, is the chief of space operations. And Stephen, you specifically wrote a piece about China's launch yesterday of its own space plane. What was that conversation like with the general? And it sounded like there was no question in his mind that this was not a coincidence that theirs happened to launch the same week that the Space Forces was supposed to, the X-37B.
Yeah, exactly. Like Sandra was saying earlier, one of the things he said was that when the X-37B or China's space plane, either one or both are in orbit, they're the two most watched objects because they're both large enough to be easily tracked with the the space surveillance network and also with commercial networks. So people know where they are. And even though the X-37B orbit is classified, we've seen the amateur community track it and come up with a reasonably precise orbital solution. So, people know where they are, and there's a lot of interest and speculation surrounding both of these programs. And he specifically, General Saltzman, I asked him in his roundtable with reporters, what he thought about China launching the same week as the X-37B was supposed to be launching, and he said he thought it was probably no coincidence that the Chinese are trying to match the U.S. in the timing of these missions. So we'll see how long the Chinese space plane is up there. It did launch into kind of a similar orbit that the previous Chinese space planes have launched into, but as Sandra's colleague Andrew Jones wrote, it could be up to new tricks, new techniques, new technologies to be tested on this mission. So we'll see where it goes from there. Whereas what's really fascinating about the X-37B on its upcoming mission is it appears to be going into some kind of really unusual orbit, a very highly elliptical orbit potentially, that based on kind of the sleuthing that the open source community does on where the rocket drop zones are for the core stage and upper stage, all seems to point that it's going into a near polar or very high inclination orbit, at least potentially, that will stretch tens of thousands of miles above the Earth. But the proof will be in the pudding. So, like I mentioned, these things are pretty easy to track from the ground. So after the launch, I expect those projections to be clarified, confirmed, or disproven. We'll see.
Well, and speaking of big things that are easy to track, obviously one thing that we've all been keeping our eye on is the development of ULA's Vulcan rocket. Stephen, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, that'll be launching one of the moonbound missions. Now we know next month. It was still a possibility of a Christmas Eve launch once upon a time. That time has now since passed. The rocket has since returned, I believe, to the vertical integration facility over at Space Launch Complex 41. Question to you first, Stephen. Now that we are almost at the cusp of seeing Vulcan finally launch, based on your reporting, how confident do you feel like that January window is achievable for ULA? And do you think it will go as planned? And I guess sort of a side-along question to that, will Peregrine be able to do what so few have been able to and have a soft landing on the moon?
Well, it seemed like, I would say that it's as likely to happen as any launch is likely to happen 3 or 4 weeks out, because you never know what can go wrong. It looked like December 24th was going to be a solid date for them. They had some schedule margin for that until some ground system problems during this last dress rehearsal fueling test threw a wrench into those plans. So from Tory Bruno, from his latest update on X a few days ago, he seemed very happy with the way this latest fueling demonstration went at the launch pad earlier this week. They've rolled it back, as you said, Will, and the next step will be to install the Peregrine lander and its payload fairing on top of the Vulcan rocket, and then roll it back out to the pad for this launch on January the 8th. So, I think a lot of that fueling test, they got that behind them. So I think there's a good chance they'll get to a launch attempt on in January, in this window of a few days beginning the 8th of January. But it's a brand new rocket, so there's going to be some unknowns getting to T0. They've done the static fire test, but that was 6 months ago now. So they have to get through that, and then we'll see if they can get to T0 and get the thing off the ground. But I do actually have high confidence in the Vulcan rocket when it does lift off. The ULA has an excellent track record with their Atlas and Delta rockets. I think the big unknown, well, they probably would say it's not unknown because they've done a lot of testing on it. The big thing to watch will be the performance of the BE-4 engines in flight. I think that's going to be a huge milestone to get those engines flight tested and flight proven. And as for the Peregrine lander, I think NASA, who has bought a lot of the capacity in this mission, would be the first to admit, it's not a given that it's going to succeed. I think Thomas Zurbuchen, the former NASA Science Mission Directorate administrator, was saying a few years ago when this CLIPS program, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services program, started, that some of these first missions probably had a 50-50 chance of success of landing successfully on the moon. I think that's probably the case with Astrobotic and Intuitive Machines.
And Sandra, obviously, ULA very eager to get through its 2 first certification missions before it can start launching national security space launch missions, hoping to do that by the end of 2024, get that first one off the ground. Given the pace of getting to the pad and launching this first time, potentially Dream Chaser being the second one, at least that's the plan right now, how confident are you from your reporting that they'll be able to work through those first 2 and actually get to their first NSSL mission by the end of 24?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen just said, it's impossible to say how any launch will go. Obviously, I wouldn't necessarily, want to predict anything. But I mean, looking back, if you go back to 2014, when Tory Bruno and Jeff Bezos signed an agreement to build an American engine for Vulcan, I mean, they were going to launch in 2018, and here we are. So this program has had a lot of problems, and of course, when we hear Tory Bruno talk, and when he's on Twitter, he seems very cheerful, very optimistic. That's his personality, and that's he's always been that way. But the Space Force is really getting impatient. I mean, the pressure is on. They won a contract in 2020 to launch national security missions, and there's I'm trying to remember exactly how many, at least 15 that have already been assigned to Vulcan. So you figure they have to launch twice to be able to get certified for national security launch. So they have to launch this upcoming one in January, then they have to launch again. That would be the Sierra Space vehicle to the International Space Station, the Dream Chaser. So they have to complete those 2, and then they would potentially get certified for national security launch. And then they also have to ramp up, which for any new vehicle is always a challenge, not just to get off the first 1 or 2 launches, but also to scale and ramp up and get into a cadence. So I think for national security launch, this is very concerning, and everyone wants to see Vulcan fly, and there's a lot of payloads that are now in backlog waiting for an opportunity to launch. And these are very expensive, very sensitive, very critical payloads for national security, including weather satellites, PNT satellites, the whole gamut of national security payloads that they need Vulcan to take to space. So I think everyone is hoping that they will be successful.
If I may, I think that's a key point that Sandra made about ramping up the flight rate, because if you look back, the Atlas V rocket took 28 months to get to the 4th flight of the Atlas V, and it took 33 months, almost 3 years, for SpaceX to get to flight 4 of Falcon 9. Mm-hmm. So I think just history would tell you that if they have a plan to get 3 or 4 flights done next year, it probably ain't going to happen, just based on the historical precedent that would set. Tory Bruno would probably say something different, and they may have a plan to get to 4 flights next year, including the Cert 1, Cert 2, and the first batch of NSSL missions. But a lot of things can happen, and I think the Space Force would love to see, they want to see, they're desperate to see the Vulcan rocket certified for national security missions, but they can't move any of those payloads over to the Atlas V because all those rockets are sold. And in fact, and Sandra may have better memory about this than me, but the phase 2 of this competition in NSSL was supposed to be a 60-40 split between ULA and SpaceX, ULA getting 60%. But when they finished doling out all of those task orders and contracts, it was more like 55%.
Yes, yes, something like that, yeah.
So
I think what that tells you is that they were very optimistic when they awarded ULA 60% of the missions. They were never expecting these delays, these extended delays. And SpaceX at that time was still kind of the underdog, whereas now, I mean, they're just so dominant. And there's a scenario under which if Vulcan continues to get delayed, they may have to give SpaceX some of these launches. And we just talked, Stephen just talked about how busy they are. They may have to take on even more work. Again, this is all hypothetical, but it's written in the contract for phase 2, for the NSSL phase 2, that if one of the providers cannot perform the mission, that they would have to give it to the second provider. And a lot has changed since this contract was awarded in 2020. So I think that there's just a lot of scenarios right now that we could go down different paths, and the Space Force just has to be prepared for contingencies.
Yeah, and talking with Dr. Walt Lauderdale earlier before the X-37B launch, she mentioned that SpaceX still needs to bring on board vertical integration capabilities. So that's something that we'll be watching to see when that comes online as well. So both ULA and SpaceX still have tasks ahead of them. In the last few minutes that we have here in this conversation, looking forward to the future of the NSSL program, obviously phase 3, first round of announcements are going to be rolling out pretty soon, and one of the players trying to make a big play for that is Blue Origin with the New Glenn rocket. Stephen, you've done some reporting recently on that. Talk about how Blue is feeling about its prospects, and it sounds like the debut of New Glenn in 24 may actually be a possibility, as is the case with Vulcan.
yeah, it's starting to look that way. I think a lot of us look at Blue Origin's announcements of when they're going to fly New Glenn, and it's like, we'll see. When I see a sign other than a blanket, a boilerplate statement from Blue Origin about the New Glenn schedule, I'll believe it. But we're starting to see some of those signs. I think we've seen some flight hardware emerge from the factory for some moving between different parts of the factory for New Glenn first stage. We've seen a payload fairing for New Glenn, either a ground article or a flight article, go out to the launch pad for some fit checks. And interestingly, this week, a couple of things. Lars Hoffman, who is the Vice President of Government Sales at Blue Origin, was at the Space Power Conference, and he really, I thought, doubled down on the prospect of launching New Glenn in 2024. He repeated that often. I was able to talk to him briefly after, and he was like, yeah, we have high confidence in launching by the end of the year, by the end of 2024, and early next year, you're going to see us having a New Glenn on the launch pad for some fueling tests. So that seems to be just a few months away when we may see that happen. And if we don't see that by the middle of the year, then I will eat crow and say they're not going to launch in 2024. But I think they have a path. And interestingly, my colleague Eric Berger had a story. Jeff Bezos did an interview with Lex Fridman, the podcaster, and he's talking about he's very optimistic of launching New Glenn in 2024. And just putting all that together seems like there's a new sense of urgency at Blue Origin to get this done.
Well, certainly there's plenty more that we could talk about. We could spend a few hours just chatting with you guys about all the things coming down the pike for national security and space flight in general, but we're going to have to go ahead and leave it there for today. So before we wrap it up, Sandra, first to you and then to Stephen, where can folks follow your work, and what do you kind of have your eye on in this upcoming week in space news?
Thank you, Will. Yes, Space News, we publish online at spacenews.com. We also have a magazine that people can subscribe. We have 4 newsletters. So go on our website and figure out what you're interested in. I have a colleague, Jeff Faust, who covers civil space. So anything you want to know about NASA, he reports on. As far as what we're looking at, I think like Stephen mentioned, there's all this uncertainty about launches. I think my colleagues and I, we were just discussing, is SpaceX going to hit 100 launches? I think that's what we're really kind of excited to see between, there's 2 weeks left in the year. Are they going to make the 100 launch milestone, which would be super cool? But of course, they're having a little bit of a rough patch right now. But I think that's something that we're all watching, and it would be really fun to see that. And they've been talking about 100 launches now for a while, but they're so close.
Absolutely. And Stephen, for you, now at Ars Technica, where can folks find more of your work in addition to that? And what's got your eye?
Yeah, you can go to arstechnica.com to see my reporting, and also reporting of Eric Berger, who has been at Ars for several years now, doing a great job. And you can also follow me on X at Stephen Clark 1. As for what I'm watching for the next few weeks, Sandra had a great one with getting to 100 launches. Will SpaceX do that? Another thing, a couple of things I would also mention is how quickly SpaceX is going to ramp up, getting ready for their third flight of Starship down at Boca Chica in South Texas. How soon in the year will they be able to launch that third test flight, and what will that third test flight do? There's a lot of talk right now within SpaceX and NASA about what objectives they want to try to achieve on that flight. And also watching what's going on with Voyager 1, which has a computer issue that seems to be kind of befuddling the engineers working on Voyager at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. That thing's been in space for almost 50 years, heading out of the solar system. A lot of interest in that, and we'll see if JPL can work another one of their miracles that they're so well known for.
Space missions, past, present, and future, always got our eye on all of them. Sandra Erwin, Stephen Clark, thank you both so much for spending part of your afternoon with us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will. My pleasure.
Alrighty, guys, have a great weekend. And want to thank our team that's helped bring this together. Adam Bernstein helping with the live chat and some of the technical aspects of the show. Our man in the chair, Stephen Young, our wonderful editor, who's also helping to guide the ship, keep things running on a technical aspect. And thank you for spending part of your Friday afternoon with us for this relaunch of News from the Press site. Really excited to get this going as a weekly enterprise. And again, we want to bring your voice into this conversation. So as we return to weekly content, be sure to send in messages as if you're a channel member, or you can use the YouTube Super Chat feature, and we'd love to feature your voice in this broadcast. We're going to be off for the next couple of weeks as we are heading very quickly into the holiday season at the end of the year, but rest assured we've got plenty of content coming for you on the other side of the new year. So be sure to stay with Spaceflight Now for all your updates on launches from the Cape and around the world, as well as plenty of other news coverage. And as we mentioned, we'll have the links to both Sandra and Stephen's work in the description box of this video, and be sure to follow them on social medias like X. So for all of us here at Spaceflight Now, I want to thank you one last time for being with us. My name is Will Robinson Smith. Be sure to be good to yourself, be good to others, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.